The silver-skinned Archons stood like statues of ice, their light staves humming with the frequency of erasure. Between them and the woman, a massive wall of muscle and fur blocked a path. Silas did not flinch when the Arbiter raised a hand to strike. He simply stepped forward, the cold steel of his blade kissing the lead official's throat. The law said she should have died when her pulsemate did. The frost was simply the Archon's way of finishing the job. If you want to see how one man defied the gods of Aethelgard to save a ghost, follow along for the rest of this journey. Now, let's look back at how they reached this edge. 11 days earlier, the station's water recycler had broken for the third time that week. That was the last day Alara had known the comfort of a roof, before the high spires of Ethelgard deemed her life a biological error. The Niflheim waste did not care about her lineage. To the frost, she was just more heat to be stolen. Alara clutched the ceremonial glass shard dagger, the only thing they had left her, as she watched the wind tear at Kale's small, shivering frame. Her son was fading. The chemical bond death that had claimed her husband was supposed to take her too, but she had persisted, and now the world was punishing her for it. Every breath felt like swallowing needles. She looked at the small fire they had scraped together. It was a pathetic, flickering thing, feeding on the last of their dried moss. When that died, Kale would die. The thought was a dull ache, more persistent than the cold. Alara pulled at the hem of her tunic. The fabric was fine, woven in the sun-drenched looms of the upper spires. It was useless here. She began to cut thin strips of the cloth with her glass dagger, feeding the expensive silk into the hungry orange light. It was a temporary reprieve, a mother literalizing the act of burning herself to keep her child warm. Then the snow screamed. A shadow fell over them, massive and jagged. Alara's breath hitched. From the white blur emerged an outlander, a creature her people called a beast of war. He was wrapped in layers of thick, dark pelt, his face scarred by a dozen winters. She raised her glass shard, her hand trembling so violently the dagger hummed. The giant didn't draw a weapon. Instead, he reached for his shoulders, unbuckling a heavy, scent-drenched pelt coat. He threw it onto the snow between them. It was a mountain of fur that smelled of musk and old smoke. "Stay and burn your clothes until the wind takes you, or follow me to the ridge." His voice was like grinding stones. Alara looked at the coat, then at the savage who had offered it. In Aethelgard they were told outlanders were beasts of war, but beasts do not give away their warmth to a dying child. She reached out, her fingers sinking into the thick, coarse fur of the coat. It was the heaviest thing she had ever felt, a stark contrast to the weightless silks of her former life. Silas pressed the edge of his blade against the Arbiter's throat, his voice a low growl that defied the ancient laws of Aethelgard. The snow did not just fall, it hunted. Silas moved through the gale with a predatory grace that Alara couldn't reconcile with his massive frame. He led them to a jagged overhang where the ruins of a pre-collapse outpost offered a brittle sanctuary. Inside the hollowed-out shell of the building, the air was still frozen, but the wind's teeth were gone. Silas didn't speak as he struck a flint, his movements rhythmic and sure. He didn't look at them, but he kept his body between the open door and where Alara huddled with the child. Suddenly a sound tore through the whistling storm. It wasn't the wind. It was a wet, heavy thud against the exterior metal. A tundra beast, white-furred and three-eyed, lunged through the threshold. Its claws scraped the floor with a sound like sharpening knives. Alara froze, her pulsemate's absence, a hollow ache in her chest that told her she was supposed to be defenseless. Silas did not hesitate. He met the beast with a roar that sounded more elemental than human. The struggle was short and terrifyingly efficient. He used his weight like a falling hammer, his blade finding the soft seal of the creature's throat. When it was over, he wiped the dark ichor from his sleeve and returned to the fire as if he had simply closed a window. The silver ships came to erase an error. They didn't count on the error having a guardian with a cold steel blade. And now, in the shadow of the outpost, under the silence of the Archons, the blade remained steady. Silas didn't move an inch as the lead arbiter's light staff flickered. "The bond is severed," the arbiter intoned, the sound vibrating in Alara's teeth. "The female is a ghost. She must be returned to the ice." "She isn't a ghost," Silas growled. "She's a choice." He pressed the metal harder against the arbiter's neck. For the first time in her life, Alara saw an immortal blink. The Archons lived by code and chemistry, by the predictable flow of biological destiny. They had no protocol for a man who would kill a god for a stranger. "Declare her non-existent," Silas commanded. "Erase the record and she stays in the world. Or keep the record, and I'll see how much silver blood it takes to drown this waste." The arbiter's eyes shifted to Alara, then back to the steel. With a sharp hiss, the light staves dimmed. The silver vessel began to rise, its hum fading into the roar of the storm. The error had been corrected through omission. Hours later, the adrenaline had long since cooled. Silas sat by the fire, a jagged line of red seeping through his tunic from a raider's grazing shot earlier that evening. Alara watched him, her hands finally steady. She reached out, taking a clean cloth and a bowl of melted snow. As she began to wash the wound, she felt the heat of his skin. In Eithilgard, intimacy was a programmed response, a chemical lock-and-key mechanism. But this was different. There was no code forcing her hand. She looked at Silas, and for the first time she wasn't looking at a beast or a savior. She was looking at a man she had decided to trust. She had spent a lifetime bound by chemistry and code, never knowing that the strongest bond is the one you choose to keep. Kale stirred in his sleep, his small face buried in the deep, dark fur of the outlander's coat. The heavy garment was no longer an alien transaction of survival. It had become a sanctuary. Alara pulled the edge of the pelt over her own shoulders, drawing the warmth toward her. The fire popped, casting long shadows against the ruined walls.